invite to speak. One of the things I really liked about the event in Manchester was the opportunity to connect up, hear about people's research and what they're doing. I know it's much harder to do that on Zoom. So I kind of want to say that if people want to connect up outside of today's event, I'm more than happy to do that. Hopefully, I'm really hoping to be able to be here for the whole day. So hopefully there'll be lots of opportunities for discussion and opportunities to connect up and for me to hear your ideas and the things that you're working on. As Anna alluded to, and I think I always give a health warning when I'm doing a talk because they're always incredibly depressing. And yes, 2020, I'm going to come back to that throughout my short presentation. It's incredibly challenging for all of us. And I think if I'd have been giving this talk back in June, and if we hadn't have had the pandemic, I probably would have been talking a lot about Brexit and the challenges of the future. And now we have another added layer of complexity. So I'm going to try and do three things today. I'm going to start very briefly with the context, and I know Kim in particular will be picking that up later, and Adam in their talk. So hopefully I'm not going to overlap too much, but just give a little bit of context from my perspective. I then want to talk a little bit about the concept of transitions, because partly in response to your agenda for this meeting and the conversations we had back in Manchester, it made me start to think again about how I think about the concept of transitions and how I've written about it. So I want to kind of revisit that briefly, and hopefully that will help to set up the conversations that are going to follow in the breakout sessions. Just a final plug before I move on to the main talk. I'm obviously editor of Journal of Youth Studies. We're always looking for really good papers, and again, I would encourage people to reach out to the editors if you've got an idea for a paper. We really do like to hear from people, and often that first reaching out, particularly at early stages of your career, can be really important for the success of a paper down the line. So please do be in touch. Okay, I'm going to move on now and say a little bit more about the context. Well, if you listen to our Prime Minister, the first quotation there was just after Boris was elected to Prime Minister, and he says he wants to make this country the greatest place on earth to live. Our children and grandchildren will be living longer, happier, healthier and wealthier lives. It really seems to ring quite hollow given all what we know about the context. But even as recently back in June 2020, he, in his very traditional way of speaking, presenting kind of grand narratives about how great things are going to be and moving to use that language of levelling up. Very interestingly, the doubling down on levelling up, which I still struggle to even really get my head around what he means by that. But we're kind of used to these political tropes. They do a lot of heavy lifting politically, and they do a lot of work in terms of framing how people think about particular issues. And we only need to look at what happened at the election and thinking about the Get Brexit Done mantra that really seemed to make all the difference in terms of the election. So I think these narratives are important, and I think it's important for us as youth researchers to think about how we challenge some of the myths around young people. And I think that there's a lot of good work going on in that area, but for me, it's really important to connect to what's happening politically. And I think it's really interesting that even back in June 2020, given all that was happening around us, that Boris Johnson's still able to give these kind of positive narratives about what's happening and what the government's going to do to make life better for people. Of course, we know that the reality is actually very, very different. And we're all well aware, I'm sure, in the room that young people's lives are increasingly very difficult, regardless of the backgrounds that they come from. But we do know, particularly for those most disadvantaged young people, that they are facing incredible challenges. So whilst it's really important to look back over what's happened over the last 40 years, and I think there's been lots of good narratives and research that have really kind of helped us to understand how issues around industrial decline have impacted particular places and young people's lives. But the last 10 years have been incredibly challenging, particularly for families on low incomes. We've seen huge changes to the welfare system, particularly for those who are on out of work benefits, massive increases in child poverty, and incredible pressures on families that are relying on food banks. Very often, most often, these are families who are in jobs. So I think the context has been incredibly challenging for a long time. We then have Brexit, which comes into the frame. And of course, we don't really know at this point what Brexit is going to mean. I think there's lots of good evidence that it's not going to mean very much that's very good for the ordinary person. And then, as if you couldn't add any more layers of difficulty, we have the pandemic. And I really do think this presents all sorts of challenges. And I'm hoping that within some of the conversations we'll have today, that perhaps there's going to be some opportunities for new ways of thinking and living going forward. So I promise I will try and end on an optimistic note, because I am aware that having always presented research that feels depressing, that it seems even more depressing in 2020. Okay, so I'm going to move on and just talk a little bit now about transition, because I'm conscious of time. And I want to just say something about my own kind of use of transition in the way that I try and do research with young people. And I revisited an article that I wrote with colleagues a while back. In fact, it was quite a while back. It was published in 2001 in Sociological Research Online, which makes me feel quite old. But in reading it, I was kind of struck by how the kind of defence that we give in this article, which is called Snakes and Ladders in Defence of Studies of Youth Transition, really seems to hold even today, and I think I do hold quite closely to it in my own work. I'm conscious of time, so I'm probably not going to read all of this quote, and I'm sure you can read it out for yourselves. But what the article tries to do is to really kind of try and understand what the concept of transition can do for us as youth researchers to help us understand what is happening in young people's lives. So I'm just going to talk about very briefly the 7 defences that we give in this article in terms of what the concept might be able to do for us. Could I just get the next slide up? Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, so there's 7 sort of things here that I think are really important. And I'm sure you'd be familiar with lots of this, but I think trying to bring these things together really helps us to be better youth researchers in how we understand what's happening. So for me, really good youth research should be able to connect to not just the wider context in which young people's lives are lived, and take account of their own individual lived experiences and bring those things together, but we should be looking at the broader political context and what's happening. So taking things a step further. And I think really good youth research does do that. And it's not easy, and I'm not saying for 1 minute that I always get this right in my own work, but I think if we can have an ambition to try and bring those things together, we will do better work in our own research and in what we aim to do for young people. So the first point is that transitions are complex and non-linear, and also that they're unpredictable, insecure, and contingent on what's happening to young people. And I do think qualitative research really allows us to get to that story about what's going on and how things can fold in a really cumulative way into other events in young people's lives. One of the key critiques of transitions research has often been that it's a bit dry, it relies on statistics. And I think that over more recent years, the really good work has been the qualitative work that can complement those statistical studies, but really allows us to grasp what's happening in young people's lives. And we know that for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, that they don't have the resources or the cushions to be able to move forward and mitigate against some of the complexities or challenges or difficulties that come through in their lives. The idea of critical moments, and other people have written really well about this, I think has been used to good effect in youth studies. But I'm starting to think, and I'll come back to it on the next slide as I finish up, that I'm wondering if 2020 is going to become a critical moment. And I hope it can become a critical moment in a big way for society, because it feels like a lot of things are colliding at the moment in terms of really very, very big political, important issues. The other thing I would draw attention to is trying to understand transitions holistically. And again, I think this is going to be really significant going forward. So one of the things that I've written about with colleagues elsewhere has been around bereavement, and that hasn't been a huge thing in our research at all, but it was something that came through in trying to kind of think about the round and the whole and what's happening. And we shouldn't have been surprised that bereavement was there. And I don't mean bereavement of grandparents, I'm talking about parents or siblings. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I saw a statistic that said over 40 children in one school in Middlesbrough were bereaved by COVID. And you start to kind of think about how is that going to impact young people. Some of them had lost parents only in their 30s. So you can kind of see how this issue, particularly in the context we're all in, which is incredibly challenging, where people haven't been able to say goodbye to relatives, where perhaps they've lost somebody very suddenly, they haven't necessarily been able to go to funerals. So there's a whole raft of issues for me there that perhaps aren't the key focus of what we're doing in youth studies, but I think it's just one example of how we really need to be thinking more than ever in the round about how young people's lives fit together. I think the longer term view, again, it's really important. I mentioned earlier, and I'm probably getting close to my time, so I'll try and speed up a little bit. I think particularly thinking about how we manage that. We've had all of these years of neoliberal kind of policies. We know that things have been going in the wrong direction in terms of inequality, but how do we now process that in the context of what's gone on in 2020? So again, I would reiterate, perhaps more than ever, we need to be taking that long view, making sure we're taking account of history. The lived realities, so I've kind of covered that, but I think the concept of transition does allow us to be able to really get to what young people's lives are like, and to give their perspectives and to give their accounts, and to involve them in really telling the story of what life is like. And I think that's really powerful in youth research. And the final point there is really just to think about locality and place. And again, I think this is really coming to the fore with the pandemic. We're seeing that places being very intrinsically used in the way that we're being managed, and how we're different places are going into lockdown. I can see all sorts of perhaps more positive connections for the youth field, certainly in terms of thinking more globally, which I think has been and continues to be a challenge for the youth studies field. So I would hope that there might be some chinks of light in some of the context that we're in at the moment. And that for me, I do find revisiting that, it reminds me of the way that I've approached youth transitions, and why I still, even though this article is really quite dated now, it still seems to me very relevant in how I think about transitions. So just to finish up, because I'm possibly over my time, some of you will have seen this before, this diagram that I put together, which I feel quite proud of for some reason, possibly because I never do this kind of thing normally in my talks. But those of you who have seen it before will remember that I had in the bits over here where I've now got the EU, Brexit and the COVID, they were blank. And I was really wanting you as scholars to be thinking about what the key issues are that come out of all of this complexity, in trying to kind of understand young people's lives, understanding their immediate environments, but also doing good youth research and thinking about the wider social structures, the safety nets, the sort of social policies that are impacting young people, and thinking about how those impact across generations, but also within generations. And in looking back at this, I did think intragenerational inequality probably needs to be in a bigger bubble, because for me that is always the thing. And I know Kim's going to talk a little bit about generation later, and I've always been slightly apprehensive about the generations concept, and many of you might have seen the very interesting debates we've had in the journal around that. But I think there is something here that we do need to unpick in terms of 2020. I think in just putting that into the picture here, it really brings home to me how all of the things that were there before that we know about are now overlaid by both Brexit and COVID, which are really incredibly challenging things that are going to hopefully present us with an opportunity to rethink how things have been working. So I'm going to leave it there because I know I'm probably over time, and I hope what I've tried to do is kind of provoke some questions and thinking that might feed into what comes later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for organising this, and thank you so much for putting this on. If my seminars go as well as this, like this coming semester, I'll be delighted, to be honest. I think you've done a tremendous job. Can I just check, can you all see that? Is that all clear? Everyone can see that screen? Okay, fantastic. So I've got 15 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the themes which Tracy and Kim have already kind of introduced today. This is work that my colleague Kev Rolston and I have been working on for the past year or so. We've been trying to figure out ways in which we could quantitatively show just how challenging the youth labour market has become for young people. We wanted to really convince policymakers. So that was our aim here, and we're quite explicit about that. We felt that they're ignoring all the amazing work that people are doing, showing these problems, and we thought, well, what can we do to try and, you know, is there a way that we can do that? So that's part of the motivation of this. That's what we wanted to do. And what this work basically is about, in all, I guess, is reflecting on how occupational positioning has shifted a little bit. And as Anna's already said, this is part of a special issue that's just been released in the People, Place and Policy Journal. There's a whole range of different articles in this edition. Please do check it out. It's all open access as well, which is even better. So everyone can look at it, which is ideal for what we want. There's a lot more exciting stuff than my stuff as well. So we've got stuff on inclusive disability, educational work. We've got stuff on post-industrial context. We've got stuff on precarity and temporary work, stuff on housing. Please do have a look at it. I hope it's useful for people, especially for PhD students as well. Okay, I'll just crack on then. So with, hang on, just get going in that. With this talk, I guess, one of my motivations was, and my motivation overall, I guess, in my research, is to reflect on youth labour markets, what they are, what they do, how do young people interact with them. And my particular, I guess, inspiration, well, the moment I got interested in this work was when I worked at Woolworths in Southport in December 2008. I realised that many people might not know what Woolworths is. Woolies was essentially a quite big hardware store, part of, kind of ran all the way up to late 2000s. And I graduated 2008, from the degree in social policy as a first-gen student going to university. And I got a job here and recession hit, and I saw all my friends who got a job with me in similar occupations, kind of as part of a kind of working class transition, we all lost jobs. Everyone did it at the same time. And the point about Woolworths and why I'm thinking about it even now, many years later, is that at that point, there were so many people who were like me, who had just come out of university. There were some people that had worked there, were developing careers there. There were others who were, starting jobs for the first time. And everyone lost their job together. And it made me kind of realize how important a job like that can be for young people from a very intimate perspective, a very personal perspective. So writing this work up this year, I've been thinking back to my days in Woolies, and it was a great job. I really enjoyed it at the time. But in particular, what happens when that type of job goes, when those kind of opportunities go, what happens to young people at that time? So I'm going to start off just by reflecting on that a little bit. The kind of questions that guided this project were about what happens when we lose those jobs, what impact does it have on youth transitions, and this big national question, since the recession, has there been this fundamental reshaping of the UK youth labour market? Have we seen something that's altered so evidently that we need to do something about it? We need to get policymakers to be more aware of it. So I'm going to buzz through some of this, because I got a bit carried away and made loads of slides, so I'm going to run through some of these things that are a bit too, so I don't want to take too much time up. But this is going to be roughly what I'm going to talk about today. Go through methods, go through findings, and I'll go through the kind of conceptual work a bit later on as well. If you looked at the UK youth labour market a few years ago and looked at the particular government briefings about it, you would think that it was a lot better than perhaps it really is. From the Great Recession, we saw a kind of a jump in unemployment, as you can see here. 2008. This period, I might add, wasn't in any way perfect or good. There were many problems here that hasn't been acknowledged as well. We saw a jump and obviously a kind of fall, kind of post 2013 or so. And what often has happened here is that government have kind of said, well, look, our figures are good. Youth unemployment is fine. It's not a problem. Look what it used to be like at other times in history. We're in a good period with it right now. And they do this in different ways. They sometimes do it historically. They sometimes do it by comparing across the EU. And they say, look, we're kind of average from 11% in comparison to other ones in 2019. So it looks, according to the way they look at it, quite relatively successful. You could have that interpretation from examining these particular figures and so on. However, as other researchers like Rob McDonald have said, there's a lot more going on in the labour market with precarity, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But one of the things that the government have done quite sneakily, I think, and this is something that Rob makes a great argument about in this 2019 paper, is that they've kind of taken things like precarity and reframed it and made it quite positive. They said, well, you know what, the gig economy and all this stuff, it's about individualisation, about helping young people in terms of flexibility and so on. And not actually seeing it for the exploitative practice it actually rather is, and how damaging it can be in terms of youth transition. So often you'll see things like this, youth unemployment is fallen more like 45%. Unemployment is much lower than it was in the 1970s. Until COVID, of course, this was kind of their rhetoric. And even explicitly saying things like the gig economy has changed all that. We've seen the rise of the everyday entrepreneur, people that own their own time, control who receive their services. And this is an argument that actually government have often done this all the way back since the 1990s, 1980s, to be honest. They often reframe these debates in a way that suits their own agendas and so on. So in lots of ways, the kind of surface kind of positive spin isn't quite the reality. And that's what we wanted to show in this article in particular. And as many fantastic youth sociology scholars have been establishing and finding over recent years, there's a whole host of different problems actually in the UK labour market. Underneath the surface, a recession really accelerated the increase of precarious work. That was already happening before anyway. Ken Roberts found that from a global perspective, that we had a lot more precarious work than was being acknowledged at the time, even before 2008. And if you start looking at how they measure employment, it's a bit dodgy, to be honest. It's 1 hour per week of paid work, and that means you're employed. That's all they need to do. That's all that figure means. It's also quite snapshots, binary categorization, ignores spatial context and so on. And there's been no doubt that we've seen a rise of precarious work. And we've seen this and proven this now quite a lot in different ways. I won't talk about this too much, but things like the gig economy, 0-hour contracts, temping arrangements, different types of internship, both unpaid and paid, which can be both exploitative. And of course, kind of things like underemployment in terms of skill level, where someone might be not utilising their full facet of skills, and underemployment in terms of paid work, where they want more paid hours, but the labour market isn't delivering that. If you actually look at this since the 1990s, you can see a real rise of this type of working arrangement throughout the UK labour market, and it particularly affecting young people, especially. Of course, before that, we had a whole host of other kind of issues to reflect on as well. Existing temporary, low-quality, low-skilled and low-wage positions have carried on in many parts of the country, as found by Teesside studies by Tracy and Rob back in the late 2000s and so on. And overall, arguably, I would kind of go with the focus that there has been a kind of risk of a low-pay, no-pay cycle. This churning of unemployment and insecure poor work has carried on. And I think it's got worse as a result of the recovery as well. Because the recovery from 2009 was quite slow and quite long. And I think actually these issues have risen to the fore again with COVID, but in other ways, they've never really gone away. We've always had them. So what we did when we started to think about our work was, okay, if we can't find the precarity stuff, what could we look at beyond that? And we thought, well, let's look at shifting occupational position. Now, all this means is a type of job that people do. That's all occupational positioning refers to. But if you look at it kind of sociologically as an indicator, it's quite a powerful way of looking at things like life chance, social material reward, health, all sorts of things in terms of people's kind of life chances throughout life course and so on. And if you looked into the literature around occupational shifts in this time, post-recovery, post-2009, what you see is there was a bit of a decline in key sectors that have traditionally employed young people, like the Woolies jobs I referred to before, your services, your retail, jobs where young people often would go and get their first, perhaps, instance of employment. And actually what was kind of happening in the recovery was that quite a lot of young people were being squeezed out of these types of occupations that previously employed them. In particular, things like graduate employment was kind of displacing kind of some of the kind of non-graduate workers, and this was a problem. And a lot of the analysis of this occupational change points to this idea that there was a recovery, but it was leaving young people and some places behind quite significantly. The labour market on the surface looks like it's improved, but actually this improvement has been often quite superficial because of the issues that we're already raising. And with that in mind, we started to think of, okay, we've got the occupation side of it, but what about the fact we have social divisions that are also being ignored, things like ethnicity, class, and gender? What about space and place? What about, the actual relationship young people have with the labour market itself? What's happening to different groups of vulnerable young people? And this is kind of what we tried to build our analysis around, this question of, how do we start showing the extent of these issues? Prowling and Community say as well, you know, there are large differences in employment levels within the UK, which reflect a familiar pattern of labour market disadvantage, and this economic distress, you know, has been there for some time and has failed to adjust to the change in geography of the UK's economy. So the kind of recovery hasn't been even and hasn't delivered, you know, the same outcomes for every group of young person. And we felt things like local challenges to individual local contexts, like Tracy mentioned before in a talk, are quite key. Things like, you know, moving away from a coastal town due to a lack of work, you know, these kind of things need to be taken into account. And we felt as well that this historical analysis could help us show this change, especially if we can show how spatial differences have changed over time. So that's kind of what we were thinking of with this work. So I'm going to kind of buzz through this a little bit. The 3 questions that we wanted to answer of our analysis, I hope we've tried to do so. As we said before, what's happened from 2005-7 to 2015-2017? So we took 2 years before recession, 2 years afterwards, and we basically then compared and contrasted between the two. We thought, let's just look at it like that. We thought, has there been any regional occupational patterns? Has there been any change that we can see? And has there been any evidence of gendering in particular? We wanted to look at gender. We felt there was particular concerns around the inequalities around gendering. We wanted to shine a light on it as well. So I'm not going to go through the methods of this. I'll be quite brief. I just thought I've only got 15 minutes, so I want to get through the analysis. But we did linear regressions, and we basically tried to do something where we looked at occupational kind of positioning. And with that analysis, we could basically show different levels of occupational position by different numbers. So the key point, just remember at this point here, is that we've got a scale of 0 to 100, and basically the kind of higher you are on that scale, the more kind of higher position you are in terms of occupational strength versus how lower you could be. So the relative advantage or disadvantage is how it's measured. So that's all that we've done really. We did a lot of linear regressions and so on. I'll come back to some of this stuff in a moment. This isn't a perfect measure, by the way. There's lots of problems with this measure, but we felt that we could at least show some of this relative decline that we felt had happened, and that's what we were attempting to do with it. It doesn't capture some of the subtleties, you know, some of the descriptive work we would need as well, but it does show us at least broadly what's happening in terms of occupational structure. So just to show you what this actually means in practice, we've got like different scores here, and these are the different type of occupations that people would have relative to different scores. And my colleague Kev put this, apparently social humanity scientists are quite high, so I don't know about that, but this is the type of scores and employment that you would have basically here. So we could see roughly, you know, what type of levels like different people are based on our analysis. And the ones we're interested in are these ones around here, 40 to 50. These are the kind of levels that young people look to be at in relation to our analysis that we've looked at here as well. So with the labour force survey data, about 12,000 sample, you know, we control education and age on linear regression. It was split by gender as well, because the way CAMSIS, the data set, is operationalized. And we come up with different things really. So what I've got here, and it won't be too many of these, I promise. This is just, I'm not going to throw loads of graphs at you. I hope. Is we've got every spatial location what we have in the LFS data set. So we've got from Scotland to inner London, and we've got lots of cities and regional kind of areas in particular. And this is essentially the occupational position of 18 to 24-year-old men by region. And this is a score of occupations I mentioned just before. And what we can see here for men is that looking at these two periods, so 2005, this is our darker line, and 2015, our kind of more our dotted line, we can see it looks like that men have had quite significant advantages since this time. There's been kind of movements upwards from kind of these kind of positions here to much higher, especially in places like Greater Manchester, especially places like Merseyside, especially South Yorkshire. Other places it stayed pretty similar, like inner London and outer London, West Midlands. And these big outliers kind of intrigued us. We wanted to know what was going on here, what's happened, you know, and actually, is this accurate? Because we know precarity and so on has caused the opposite effect. So we wanted to delve a little bit deeper. We have a similar graph for young women in the labour market as well, and we see essentially the opposite here. We see a decline in occupational positioning for young women in particular. So this is our 2005 line, 2007. These are 2015 line, and we can see real quite disadvantages, especially in Northern Ireland, especially in Tyne and Wear, especially in places and parts of the country where we wanted to figure out what's going on. But overall, we could see a clear disadvantage looking at over this 10-year period for young women. And this really concerned us because we thought to ourselves, well, clearly this hasn't really been acknowledged properly by policymakers, and why are they not doing something about it? Looking into it a bit more detailed, we tried to think, okay, can we look at certain types of regional context? So our outliers like Manchester, our outliers like London, we thought, what's going on? And this is where we started to get a bit of a better understanding around what's happening with our two data sets. We started to see these bubbles here represent occupations, basically. So this is 2005 Manchester young men, and this is 2015. And we can see in comparison that there was a lot less work that young people were doing in comparison to the 10-year period, a lot less work, not just in terms of volume, a lot less diversity of work. And this started to explain what was happening. Men, it seemed, in Manchester have just less work overall. And the rises you see here are down to the kind of advantage jobs kind of disappearing as well. So this isn't as positive as it first might appear, according to our other graph. And when we start looking at other kind of regions of outliers, we had this trend again. A lot more work available 2005, a lot less work available 2015, and across the whole piece as well. So this was in London for men. We had exactly the same thing happen. These are kind of your lesser, your occupations, which are, we have middling ones and kind of low ones all going, and it seems like there's some kind of disappearance happening here. We saw exactly the same trend as well with young women. We looked at, in particular, in this instance, Northern Ireland. We had this outlier we wanted to investigate, and again, we could see these kind of problems, happening again. Just an absolute, quite extraordinary amount of jobs that are gone, and we don't know what's happened to them. We were a bit like, what does this mean? We're unsure ourselves a little bit. But again, we can see just what's happened in terms of these different groups. And we see that same thing again with London as well. This trend of jobs just disappearing for young people as a whole. So looking at all this together, I've got a couple of minutes. I don't want to spend too long on this. It seems, looking at our analysis, that occupational positioning, there's not just been a rise of precarity, but there's also been a leveling down of employment opportunity for young people to do. And if you compare across this 10-year period, there's not just less volume of employment, there's less diversity in the labour market in terms of labour market opportunity. It's particularly disproportionately impacting women. And there's some quite interesting things with analysis as well to talk about London, which I'll get to a bit later. And of course, overall, we've seen this elimination of occupations as well, which is really concerning, especially at this kind of disproportionate part of the labour market too. So there's a few things just to note with youth transitions here, just to kind of reflect on. There's been this hollowing out of youth labour market. I think, as Tracy says, I think things have got much worse. And I think that's collective. I think that's shared. I think, we looked at every single location, tried to see if this kind of trend held true, and it seemed to. There were less jobs for young people to do. It seemed to be multi-spatial and historical. And it made us reflect on the idea that actually, for those people with lesser qualifications and less advantages in the labour market, this is a much harder time, a much harder labour market to negotiate for them, as Linda McDowell argues in her work as well. And in a sense, this explains lots of things, perhaps around low pay, no pay cycles. Rather than a gradual stepping stone, I think many young people are entrapped in a difficult situation if they can't leave their local labour market as well. So there's lots of things to say about that too. The other thing we thought about youth transitions is that this obviously might explain why young people are choosing alternatives such as apprenticeships, further and higher education. There's interesting questions around, what that means for the labour market. And I think there's interesting questions around, what if young people want to do something else? What are the alternatives for them? And this is particularly prescient right now due to COVID-19, because many young people will be right now thinking, do I go to university? Do I stay at home? Do I take a job for 12 months? Thinking about those transitions it's going to be quite difficult for them to do so. The sharpening of the decision making, you know, the more challenging situation they're in, I think is quite interesting as well to think about. So overall, just to kind of leave that there, I hope I've not gone on too long. Our question is, and for the provocations, maybe a question to reflect on, where have all these jobs gone? You know, that's what we're kind of wondering ourselves. There's a real need here as well, in a kind of deeper sense, to get policymakers to reflect on demand rather than supply. This is evidently an issue that there's not enough jobs for young people, not enough high quality jobs for young people, and there's got to be more focus on that. You know, and of course, with COVID-19, that's going to accelerate much of the developments that we've already talked about here as well. So yeah, I hope that's useful. I'll leave that there. Thank you so much.
So first of all, I want to say thank you very much to the organisers for, first of all, arranging this event, but also for persevering and managing to make it happen eventually, albeit in these slightly different contexts. So it's fantastic to be part of it. So obviously when I was originally invited to present, this was pre-COVID, and I had obviously a different paper planned. But as we've already seen in Tracy and Adam's presentations and in the breakout groups, we can't think about youth transitions without thinking about this current moment of COVID and what this perhaps presents for young people in particular. And in my previous work, I've looked at how young people form their aspirations, but also make transitions in times of crisis, and in particular, the kind of aftermath of the global financial crisis and austerity. So what I wanted to do in this kind of paper really was kind of to think back to some of that work and to reflect on my previous research around youth in times of crisis, but also to think about this current moment of COVID and what it might mean for both youth transitions, but also what questions, what kind of particular agendas it raises for the field of youth studies. So, let me move. Oh, why is this not working? Okay. So I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, but I think it's useful just to kind of set the context really for what we know already about COVID and its impact on young people. And of course, we're still in kind of relatively early days of the crisis, but it's already quite clear that the crisis and the kind of policy responses to it are likely to have a particular impact on young people. So there's been various kind of reports and analysis, largely by think tanks at the moment, which has kind of looked at the potential scarring effect of COVID on young people's wages and future career prospects. We've seen in the realm of graduate transitions that there's been a marked drop in graduate recruitment, but also, you know, for non-graduates as well. And this, we talked about this in my breakout group, kind of the decline or withdrawal of other kind of work placement opportunities for young people. So this has led a number of scholars, including scholars at the LSE, to talk about how COVID presents a kind of dark age of declining social mobility for young people. So this kind of bleak prospects. And we're also seeing that this is manifest in surveys around young people's well-being, and, you know, with young people reporting particularly elevated feelings of anxiety and fear about their future. But if we think about youth transitions in a broader context, we might also think about how this might be impacting on other aspects of their lives. So more recently, there was interesting research by Lupi et al., which was a survey of young people across Europe, looking at the potential impact of COVID on young people's plans to start a family. And it showed that in the UK, there was a particularly marked effect on young people with COVID and the kind of economic uncertainty it would be unleashing, putting off young people aged 18 to 34 of having a child, by either kind of postponing those plans or abandoning them. So in this kind of context and this kind of emerging evidence, it's kind of no surprise then that we've seen this discourse of a kind of lost generation emerge, where young people are seen to be kind of particular victims of the crisis. And of course, this does sit alongside a less sympathetic discourse in the media, which is of young people as kind of being irresponsible and going out partying and going to raves and kind of not taking the pandemic seriously. But we're already seeing this kind of discourse of young people as a generation who lost hope in the future, whose futures have been stolen by the pandemic. So this idea of COVID-19 as being a kind of generation defining kind of moment or critical moment, I was really interested in Tracy using the concept of critical moments to think about COVID. So we've seen this come from a number of kind of journalists, from think tanks, and also obviously Tony Blair, who seems to just be brought out as a spokesperson for just about anything. So this idea of kind of young people as having lost hope in the future, that their lives and their futures are kind of derailed. But of course, we know that this is not a new discourse, and it's one that is familiar and that's circulated a number of times in recent decades. So let me just change this. So in particular, we saw a very similar discourse being circulated in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, and in particular in the implementation of austerity. And Adam has sort of traced, you know, how this broader context had affected young people. And so we saw in that context concerns around, you know, young people and their experience of precarity and uncertainty in the job market in particular. But we also saw it, for example, following the Brexit referendum, where there was an idea that young people were kind of pitted against an older leave voting kind of baby boomers, as it were. But of course, youth scholars have long warned against kind of overstating social change in young people's lives, and also isolating particular moments or crises from longer term trends. So it's important then to acknowledge that the kind of hostile conditions that we are beginning to see talked about in relation to the COVID generation are not completely new, okay? But instead, these, you know, these were not generated just by COVID, just as they weren't generated solely by austerity and the global financial crisis. So here, I think it's important to, or what's prescient here are Gargi Bhattacharya's comments about austerity, which she argued that when thinking about that moment of austerity, we have to forego the nostalgia that seeks to remake the world before austerity, not least because the pre-austerity world was also divided and unequal for many. So if we, you know, we can think about how we replace the idea of, or the concept of austerity with COVID. So, you know, making us aware of these longer term trends that affect young people's transitions. And of course, youth scholars have long kind of shown this, or allow us, that this scholarship allows us to think of COVID-19 not as something that's completely new, not a completely new rupture or break, but actually an acceleration of longer term processes through which, when it comes to youth transitions, these have become increasingly protracted, unpredictable, complex, and non-linear. And, you know, this scholarship has located this in relation to processes of neoliberalisation, deindustrialisation, and globalisation, where we see this precarity and insecurity having an impact on or destabilising these so-called traditional transitions to adulthood, where these kind of status passages or these normative markers of education, a secure job, marriage, a house, are actually happening much later in life, if at all. And scholars have looked, you know, most recently at the impact of, as I said, the global financial crisis and austerity on young people's transitions. And we saw Adam's great presentation really drawing out those kinds of impacts on young people in relation to the labour market, but also thinking about how young people make sense of those, kind of how they interpret these, and how does this transform their own notions of the future and of becoming an adult. And my own research has looked at this. So my paper in the Journal of Youth Studies, which drew on longitudinal qualitative study of young women who were graduating in this kind of post-crash landscape. So very similar to Adam's experiences of Woolworths. So kind of, and in particular, these young women were growing up under New Labour. They were very much kind of invited to invest in discourses of meritocracy and aspiration, but also kind of post-feminist discourses of female achievement and progress. And I caught up with these young women several years later after I first interviewed them to explore their transitions. And these young women had kind of graduated into the recession and were experiencing a kind of very squeezed labour market, a housing crisis, but also cuts to the welfare state. And so, you know, they were, as explained, kind of stuck in this kind of churning cycle of low paid, low skilled, precarious work that Adam talked about. So I want to sort of, I hope you can see this quote. So one of my participants, Reese, so I look at two participants in particular in the paper. So Reese was Black British, working class, had gone to university and was very much invested in this meritocratic idea of kind of investing in the future, of kind of working hard. And she talks about how she graduated into the labour market and felt completely stuck, completely deflated. So, you know, she talks here about being kind of very determined to do well, graduating, and her dreams of going to university and getting a good job were completely destroyed by this broader kind of context. But we also talked in there about how Reese compared herself to her parents' generation, and that her parents' transitions can, you know, provide a kind of template for her. So she talked about this idea of her generation going backwards and not being able to have those things that her parents were able to achieve. So in the rest of this short presentation, I want to just kind of present three reflections, or perhaps two reflections and one provocation, about what this current crisis might mean for youth transitions and how we might study this. So my first point is about the concept of transition itself, and Tracy spoke about this in her presentation and made a really good and important case for the usefulness of transitions as a concept. And you know, as we see, for example, COVID is accelerating these processes through which young people's transitions become prolonged, become destabilized, and how these kind of markers of adulthood are kind of more and more pushed into the future, then, you know, we might return to this question of, is transition a useful metaphor? And this is Andy Furlong, Dan Woodman and Joanna Wynne talking in 2011 about this concept of transition. Is it a useful metaphor for us when these kind of markers, you know, of independence, of adulthood become very elusive? But I would argue, like Tracy, that this does remain a useful concept for us. Although it's important we critically engage with it, I think it is important insofar as it remains socially meaningful to young people themselves. So young people, particularly in my research, still narrate themselves, think about the future through this framework of normative transitions and markers of adulthood, even though these don't tally with their own experiences, and even when contemporary conditions make their realisation much more difficult, if not impossible. So I argue that we need to hold on to this question or this concept of transitions as useful to us. So again, returning to Reese, even though you know, her experience of the labour market was very different, we still, you know, see that she's still narrating herself through this idea of kind of normative transitions, and in particular how she struggles to negotiate or reconcile her anticipated or desired transitions of having a house, getting married, potentially having children, and the lived reality. So I think it's really important then that we still think about how young people, even within these broader contexts where adulthood or the markers of adulthood becomes much more kind of elusive, much more difficult for some young people, that we still need to think about how young people narrate and subjectively understand their own transitions and understandings of success, but also their orientations to the future, but also how those are being done within families. I think thinking about the role of parents is also really important here. So that was my first point. My second point, or kind of, I guess this is more of a provocation, but really that when thinking about youth transitions in this moment of crisis, we must, as with all investigations, critically deploy the category of youth, with particular attention to issues of inequality and difference. And this has already been discussed in previous conversations and breakout groups today. So whilst we might think of COVID-19 as representing a kind of generational defining moment for young people, the risks and insecurities that it unleashes, as with previous crises, will be experienced differently across vectors of class, gender, race, ethnicity, disability and place. So we know that the pandemic will not only be worse for young people who are already structurally disadvantaged, but the crisis and potentially policy responses to this, and we can already find evidence of this, will likely augment and deepen those inequalities. So, for example, we might think about the exam grade fiasco, where we saw in particular it was disadvantaged students who were most kind of disadvantaged in that. But also labour market data shows that it's the lowest qualified workers and non-graduates who are most hit by the economic turmoil. In particular, this is, and I think useful thinking to Adam's presentation about the sectors, labour market sectors that hit through COVID, kind of leisure, hospitality, service industries, and retail. So you know, we can already see the class inequalities that are at play here. But I think what I've been grappling with, and I think is important for us to consider as researchers, is about the intersection of class and racism, and thinking in particular how the impact of COVID on minoritised and migrant youth, who are already structurally disadvantaged in the labour market and in education, and who will inevitably, most likely, be exposed to risk within the current crisis. So we know, for example, government data shows already that it's BAME groups who have higher rates of infection and death. And even though the government reports provide only descriptive statistics, Runnymede and other great organisations have really pushed for examining why this is, you know, and thinking about this is because these populations are more likely to be working outside of the home, or more likely to be in multi-generational or overcrowded housing, use public transport, and therefore much less able to self-isolate and shield. And I've been thinking, one of the things I've been thinking of over the last few months, and I live in central Manchester, is that I've noticed when I've been out on my daily walks, or, you know, being out and about, the changing demographic of delivery drivers in the city, which previously was quite ethnically diverse. And what I noticed very soon after we went into lockdown is that, and delivery was still kind of, operating, is that it became kind of characterised by young Somali men. Okay, so you know, thinking about who can take time out of the labour market, who's protected, who is in those forms of labour which puts them most at risk in the current crisis. So how am I doing for time? I think, is it right to keep going? Hopefully. So I think it's no coincidence then that the Black Lives Matter movement has gained momentum at this moment. So the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and minority ethnic communities are, as Gary Young so beautifully and powerfully articulated, the consequences of long histories of racialised capitalism, colonialism and systematic racism that are writ large within our institutions. So for these communities then, COVID-19 has not generated a fundamentally new experience of inequality, risk and precarity, but rather it has laid bare longer-term processes of what Agrupo Emejulu and Leah Bassel call routinized crisis, the persistent, institutionalized and ordinary hardships of everyday life. So I guess my provocation for scholars of youth transitions is that although as a field I think we've been incredibly thorough at looking at inequalities of class and gender and place, location, I think we've been less successful in thinking, you know, about issues of race and ethnicity. And this is despite, you know, important work within the field by Anouk Nayak or Heidi Mirza or Anne Phoenix, or, you know, even before that, Stuart Hall. And I myself have been guilty of this kind of epistemological blind spot. So in my paper in Journal of Youth Studies, I primarily analyse Rees's account through theories of class and gendered injustice, rather than race, which are clearly pertinent to her experiences as a young Black woman. Equally, I've discussed COVID and its effect on youth in the UK, but we might think, well, what of, in particular, youth in the global South? So just as we shouldn't isolate this current crisis from longer-term trends and processes that have shaped youth transitions, we must also prioritise intersectional approaches which seek to expose, theorise and address its differential and asymmetrical impacts and effects. So I think this might mean kind of expanding our vocabularies, thinking about our conceptual tools and methods, and looking to academics and activists who are perhaps working outside of youth studies, so in critical race studies, post-colonial studies and critical sociologies of education. So thinking about Remy Salisbury's recent work around racism in school, and to engage in what Bamburgh calls connected sociologies. So my final point, and this is, I wanted to end on a more hopeful point, as we all do in these times. So although we might see many continuities and lots of kind of things that depress us around the current crisis, what perhaps is different today, and I would argue is hopeful, is the visibility of young people's voices and critical vocabularies of inequality in their kind of protest and resistance in the current conjuncture, and particularly within the space of kind of digital culture. So we've seen youth activism around Black Lives Matter movement, but also the exam fiasco, that young people have been themselves have been calling attention to structural forms of inequality. So I think it's really important to recognise this really vital political work that is being done and indeed led by young people themselves, and with that a very explicit mobilisation of a language of inequality and injustice that I personally think is something new. Having done research with young people, you know, seeing how, you know, their accounts end up always getting fed back into discourses of meritocracy and neoliberalism and individualisation. And so it's nice to see these kind of critical vocabularies out there in a way that I think wasn't as readily available before. And of course, I'm wary that as youth scholars, we tend to sometimes romanticise kind of figures of agentic and resistant youth, and perhaps project our own fantasies onto young people. I'm also cognizant that, you know, this visibility is made possible through digital culture and kind of what Sarah Bannock-Weiser calls a kind of economy of visibility, that kind of both enables these images or you know, of young people, but also potentially monetizes those. So I'm cognizant of that, but I think it's important to see and recognize the work that's being done by young people, but also to think about how then, if there is this kind of emerging visibility and language of inequality, how this might then feed back into other young people's understandings of their own transitions, of their opportunities and their futures. So I will end there.